Hey guys, would you like to know how to make your pastel drawings look more realistic? In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I created this toucan and give you some of my best tips and advice for achieving realistic pastel drawings. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. So for this piece, I'm using pan pastels for the background. And if you don't know what pan pastels are, I'll leave a link to a video in the description that goes through everything you need to know about pan pastels, but I'm applying them with a soft tool, that's SOFT. So I'm using a bunch of different colors, different greens and blues in the background to create a more out of focus kind of look. And I'm just layering that pan pastel on top of each other to create a softer effect. When you come in with your pan pastels to start with, it kind of creates a bit more of a blotchy, it has a lot of strokes in there, but if you continue to add more layers of pastel on top, it does smooth out quite a bit. And I will come back to the background and add in some other colors and a little bit more of that texture towards the end of the piece as well. But moving on to the toucan itself, I'm actually just coming in with my pastel pencils. So I'm using a variety of different brands. My two favourite brands are the Faber-Castell Pitt Pastels and the Stabilo Carbothello. And I'm also using a few of the Derwent pastel pencils as well, and those are the ones with that maroon kind of coloured barrel. I'm blocking in all the different colours that I can see in my reference photo in that area, and I'm making sure that I'm looking at those different colour shifts, so it's not all just yellow in a certain area. It sort of fades from a lighter colour, like almost white, into a yellow and then into a green, for example. So you want to pay attention to those kinds of colour shifts. You don't want to just block it all in one colour. You want to have some variation in those colours there to make it look a little bit more realistic. Then I've just come through with a cotton tip to blend out that area. And the reason that I'm blending with a cotton tip is because it actually pushes the pastel into the tooth of the paper. So when you're working with pastel or pretty much any medium, you'll hit a limit where you can't add any more layers of pastel to your paper. So by blending it out, you're actually pushing that pigment into the tooth of the paper or into those little grains of the paper. And it really helps you be able to add more layers on top that way. It also blends the colors a little bit more smoothly and also helps with that pastel dust fall off as well. So I always blend in between each layer. And I'm working in light layers as well, especially for the first few layers. You don't want to push too hard with that pastel to try and fill up the little grain of the paper. You want to just use a really light hand and press very lightly, especially in those first few layers, just so that you don't fill up that paper so you can add more layers and more details if you need to on top of that. One of the main tips that I have for drawing realistically is to actually choose a good paper. So the paper that I prefer to work on is the Clairefontaine Pastel Mat, and it is slightly more expensive than other papers, but it's 100% worth it in my opinion. I've not found any other surface that is the same or equivalent to Pastel Mat. It allows you to add numerous layers, but it also has a nice smooth result towards the end as well. There are a lot of pastel papers out there that don't let you add as many layers. It also looks quite grainy and it doesn't work as well as the pastel mat does. So if you're struggling to get the amount of layers that you need or the detail that you want, then I'd recommend trying out pastel mat. When you're working on animals that are black, you want to make sure that you're not just using black. So throughout the entire body of this toucan, I've come through with blues and reds and purples and that kind of thing throughout the black areas. If you're just using black, it can look really quite flat. It sort of looks dull and just not very interesting, whereas if you mix in other colours like blues and reds and that kind of thing with your black, it can look a lot more vibrant and a lot more realistic as well. It just looks a lot more interesting that way. I'm resting my hand on a piece of paper, and that's just to stop my hand from picking up that pastel from the surface and smudging my work and getting pastel everywhere. So a lot of people use glassine or tracing paper. You can use whatever you like. In my opinion, it doesn't make too much of a difference which paper you rest your hand on, as long as you pick up the piece of paper and place it back down rather than dragging it across your piece when you need to move it. A lot of people tend to worry about their colour choices quite a lot, and to make something look realistic, that's really not what you need to be focusing on. I get asked all the time, what colour is the best for dark skin tones or this tiger that I'm working on or a rose or whatever they're working on. I get asked what's the perfect colour to use for that, and in reality there is no perfect colour for any subject. For example, I could take a picture of the same person in 4 different types of lighting, and I'm going to use a different set of colors for each of those different lighting examples. To make something look realistic, it's not about the color choices. I could have used a bunch of different blues or reds or yellows or whatever throughout this piece, but as long as it's not too dark or too light, that's what's most important. It's got very little to do with picking the perfect color to use in that area. It's more about having your shadows and your highlights accurate. That's what's going to make it look realistic. Another thing that people seem to worry about quite a lot is the amount of detail. So they think that to make it look more realistic, they're going to add heaps and heaps of details, and that's what's going to make it look realistic. But in reality, you really don't need much detail to make something look realistic. For me, if I step back from my artwork and look at it from a normal viewing distance and I can't see the detail that I'm adding, then it probably doesn't need to be there. It's totally up to you how much detail you want to add, but for me, I don't want to spend 40 or 50 hours on one piece of artwork just because I'm trying to put in every single strand of fur or every little tiny feather detail to make it look exactly like the reference photo. I just find that it's not really necessary to make something look realistic. The 2 most important things are your values and your proportions, so making sure that your initial outline is accurate. And if you're not sure whether your values are right, a lot of people tend to not go dark enough. Most people don't have a problem with getting their highlights and their midtones right. It's usually their shadows that are not dark enough. So if you think that might be you, a good way to check is to actually take a photo of your artwork and then turn it into black and white, and do the same with your reference photo and turn that into black and white. And if you've watched any of my videos previously, I pretty much say that in every tutorial, but it's really, really helpful to see if your shadows are as dark as what the reference photo is, because when you take out that aspect of the color, you can really clearly see if your shadows in your artwork are as dark as the shadows in the reference photo, and then you can adjust them accordingly from there. So to make things look more realistic and to make it sort of pop off the page a little bit, it's actually your values that are more important than your colors and your details. If you want to watch my real-time full-length tutorials that have a lot more in-depth information, then head over to my Patreon channel. Otherwise, there's a playlist on the screen with some other pastel tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.